Okay, good morning, everyone, and welcome to day 2 of the 2023 Invasive Species Forum. Before we get started, I would just like to say that the Invasive Species acknowledges the long history of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis Nation people on the lands now known as Canada. We strive to show respect for our ancestors, their communities, and to them individually. Our head office is located on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, the Batchewana, and Garden River First Nations, as well as the longtime settlement of the Métis people in the Robertson Huron Treaty area. We encourage everyone to take time today and every day to consider the traditional lands on which you reside. Before we get started with another jam-packed day today, it's my pleasure to introduce a special guest of the morning, the Ontario Minister of Environment, Conservation and Parks, the Honourable David Piccini. You can take it away, David.
Good morning. Thanks, Mackenzie. I appreciate it. It's wonderful to be here with all of you. Thanks for the kind introduction. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to speak to all of you at the Invasive Species Forum. The theme, of course, invasive species in action in a changing climate has never been more relevant than it is today. And we know Ontario's climate is, of course, changing. With frequent weather events, everybody, I'm sure, has dealt with the frigid cold of the last few days, and then the quick thaw that we experienced here in Port Hope. Severe weather events, rain, ice storms, prolonged heat waves, and milder winters is making what you're doing more relevant today than ever before. And that's why our government is taking action to lower greenhouse gas emissions while helping communities prepare for the impacts of climate change. We know that our recent modeling shows, independently validated, that Ontario is on track to achieve its 2030 greenhouse gas emissions reductions targets of 30% below 2005 levels. We're showing Canada the way as Ontario's emissions reductions since 2005 surpass those of any other province or territory in Canada in absolute terms. But while we're taking effective steps to do our part to help address climate change, we're also taking steps to mitigate its effects on our province. Of course, this includes addressing the challenges of protecting our natural environment from invasive species. We know that climate change can accelerate the introduction and spread of invasive species, and that spread of invasive species weakens ecosystems and makes them more vulnerable to the effects of climate change. I know that you've heard from my colleagues, Minister Graydon Smith, who's speaking at that forum, who's outlined what our government is doing in his ministry specifically to help address the challenges of invasive species. And Trevor Jones, our parliamentary assistant, I believe, to the Minister of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs, is talking about what work we're doing at OMAFRA to protect our agricultural sector. This is truly a whole of government approach. The Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks is working with our partners and other governments to prevent, detect, and control invasive species. One of the ways we're doing that is through our Great Lakes Local Action Fund. I recall fondly, one of my first events as Minister of Environment was out at Hazelbird Nature Reserve in my own community of County of Northumberland. And I'll never forget being asked to cut down trees. And I thought, as Environment Minister, as I'm standing there, this doesn't feel good. I mean, I know the comms minds are probably going to give me a hard time here. This can't be a good look. And it was through learning of the important role that tall grass prairie pit plays in our community, one of the last remnants on the shores of Rice Lake, and the invasive Scots pine and what that was doing to the local ecosystem, that I then began reluctantly to then support the team and indeed take down that trees. In all seriousness, though, I think learning about invasive species and what we need to do to mitigate their effects matter. And so I was proud to support that project, albeit the challenging optics of what we had to do to start. But I've learned a great deal since then. And we're supporting projects across Ontario that protect and restore our Great Lakes, including those that combat invasive species, like the one I just mentioned. We're supporting today's hosts. We're investing in the Invasive Species Center to remove the European water chestnut in the Welland River. As we know, it poses a huge threat to the Great Lakes coastal habitats, recreation, and of course the economy. Supporting 8 trees in the Lake Erie region to convert regenerated farmland that is dominated by invasive species into a forest with wetlands. supporting the Severn Sound Environmental Association to naturalize and restore habitat through invasive species management and planting native species to create habitat for pollinators. This is so important. We're supporting the Lakehead Region Conservation Authority to restore riparian and meadow habitat in Thunder Bay, removing invasive species and improving the wildlife habitat there. And these are just a few of the examples of how Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks is supporting partners to combat invasive species and mitigate the effects of climate change. We really look forward to working with all of you. I was super impressed on a live radio show last night to be asked about invasive species. So the work you're doing matters. It's getting attention of young folks across Ontario. And I just want to thank you for being a partner, for helping work with public policymakers, as it's a two-way street, and all of Ontario. So thank you for what you do as we build healthier communities, economic prosperity through protecting our land, air, and water. I just want to thank you for having me and wish you a very productive, informative, and great day. Thanks, Mackenzie.
Thank you so much, Minister Piccini, for your kind words and for taking the time to be with us this morning. None of the work that gets done could be done without your support and the partnerships throughout Ontario and the rest of Canada. So again, thank you so much for joining this morning and for providing those great remarks.
Thanks for having me. Take care.
You take care. Okay, and with that, everyone, we can get started on our day. Few more housekeeping items. If you're just joining us for the first time today, my name is Mackenzie and I'll be your MC throughout the day and the rest of the forum. So you'll be seeing a lot of me throughout the next couple of days. Just some housekeeping items before we begin. Please use the Q&A feature for any questions. The moderators for each session will be walking our speakers through those questions at the end of each presentation. We'll be monitoring the chat to address any technical issues. So if you're having any problems there, please put those in the chat and we will assist you as soon as we possibly can. You can also refer to the attendee guide that was distributed to registrants through email to address any frequently asked questions. If you can't figure things out through there, then definitely come to us and we'll help you out. Our keynote plenaries will be taking place at 12:30 Eastern time throughout the forum. Please join us today to learn about forest biosecurity in Canada. Looking forward to that one. If you're having any poor connections with audio, you can join by phone by clicking the up arrow next to audio settings and clicking switch to phone audio in case you're having any troubles there. We will also be distributing a brief survey after the forum. Your feedback is really valuable to us and they help us to improve our event year after year. We do read everybody's comments and try to put everything into place that we can for the following year. So please take a few minutes and submit that at the end of the forum. We've got a lot going on today in addition to our presentation programming. So please join us at lunch hour today, starting at 11:50 Eastern time in our first networking session. So you can connect with others in your field. We have several tables that you can join based on your topic of interest. So head on over to the Expo tab at 11:50 Eastern time at the top of right of your screen and check out those tables and join some informal roundtable discussions so we can share information and learn from other people working in our fields. To close off the forum today at 3:40 p.m. Eastern time, we're honored to have a special guest, Lucille Ford, joining us to put on a woodland style floral art workshop. She's going to walk us through the artwork as well as talk about connections between biodiversity, land, and reclamation. Please bring a paper, pencil, and eraser, pencil crayons, or markers if you're looking to join this session. We're really looking forward to that. It should be very fun. Finally, after we close our day today at 4:30 Eastern time, join us for the Invasive Species Center Awards ceremony. The awards will wrap up by about 5 p.m. So if you can tack on an extra 30 minutes to your day, please stick around and celebrate some exceptional people doing exceptional work in invasive species management with us. With that, I'm going to give everybody a 5-minute break to get your coffee ready. And we're going to start right at 9 a.m. With our speakers for session 1. So we'll see you back in 5 minutes and we'll get started right at 9. Thanks, everyone. Okay, good morning, everyone. We're leading into 9 o'clock here. We'll just give everybody a second to trickle back in. All right. I hope everybody is ready for our first session of the day today. We're going to be talking about developments of research and management for municipalities this morning in this session. I'm excited to introduce your moderator for this morning, Madison Sturba. Maddie is the Invasive Species Center's Training and Outreach Coordinator. Maddie works mostly with me on the Forest Invasives outreach. She's been a really integral part of our new training program. So she's a great person to be taking you through the morning. So I'll pass it over to Maddie to get us started, and I'll see you guys at the break.
Well, thanks so much, Mackenzie, and welcome back, everybody, to day 2. We have a really great lineup of speakers and activities today, so hopefully you're just as excited as I am. Like Mackenzie said, my name is Madison, and I'm super happy to be your moderator today. I'll start us off here with our Municipalities Developments and Research and Management session. So I know Mackenzie mentioned earlier, but just as a little reminder, please use the Q&A feature to post your questions at any time, and I'll read the questions out to our speakers at the end of each talk. So with that being said, I'd like to give a very warm welcome to our first speaker, Dayna Laxton from the Regional Municipality of York. Her presentation will discuss the development of a program plan to tackle invasive species in York Region. So thanks so much for being here, Dayna, and I'll pass it over to you now.
Thank you so much, Madison. You just let me know that you can see that okay, Madison?
Yes, it looks great.
Perfect. Okay, thank you. Good morning, everyone. And as Madison said, I'm with York Region. I'm the invasive species specialist in the Natural Heritage and Forestry section of Public Works. And I've been asked today to give a presentation and an overview of the development of our recently finished program plan for invasive species. But first I'll start with a little bit more about what York Region is for those that aren't aware, and then I'll dive into a bit more of the history and background of the invasive species program at the region, dive into a bit of the development of the program plan and working with the Invasive Species Center on this program plan, and then a really high overview of objectives and some of the actions that have come out of this program plan that we'll be working towards, and again, another very high level capture of our management tools, and then we'll do a Q&A. So for those of you that aren't familiar, York Region is an upper tier municipal government that is geographically located north of the city of Toronto, and we're bordered by Peel in the west, Durham Region in the east, and Simcoe County in the north. We have 9 lower tier local municipalities: Vaughan, Richmond Hill, and Markham in the south, Whitchurch, Stouffville, Newmarket, Aurora, King Township, East Gwillimbury, Georgina, and 2 conservation authorities. We have TRCA, Toronto Region Conservation Authority in the south, and Lake Simcoe Region Conservation Authority in the north. And we have a few other large conservation partners that operate in York Region as well, such as the Oak Ridges Marine Land Trust, Nature Conservancy of Canada, Parks Canada, with a portion of Rouge National Urban Park you can see down in the southeast there. In terms of the evolution of the invasive species program, it actually really started with the development of a forestry section at York Region in the early 90s, and that was basically because of spongy moth. It was the first time that York Region was really seeing impacts of spongy moth outbreak, and nobody really knew what to do with it. So that was actually the kickoff of the forestry department. And then in 2001, we actually shared the first Asian longhorn beetle detection, which was right at the border of Vaughan and Mississauga. And York Region was pretty integral in terms of the on-the-ground response, working with the CFIA to eradicate that first initial detection. And then in 2008, that's when emerald ash borer was first detected in York Region in Vaughan. And so that was really the kickoff of the need for a much more robust plan to deal with this pest. And so that was the inception in 2012 of a 10-year management plan that was approved by council. And then, of course, out of that came a sort of a role, a dedicated role for pushing that management plan forward and for spearheading communications, education, and outreach. And that's when they decided to develop the invasive species specialist role at the region, which my understanding is the first of its kind in Ontario at that time. Then in 2012, all the way through 2021, we've been really working to evolve the program to not just look at dealing or addressing with emerald ash borer, but rather to look at a whole host of invasive species. Now, I will caveat that we are a forestry and natural heritage section, and a lot of the regional assets are dealing with terrestrial. So this is our program is very terrestrial based. Not to say we don't partner on aquatics at all, but it is not our direct management for our program. So, and we've developed over time an invasive species technical working group that we found to be really helpful, with representatives from parks and forestry departments or natural heritage coordinators at our local municipalities, as well as our conservation authorities. We all come to meet about 2 times a year, talk about latest science, information sharing, have technical presentations and things like that. And then we worked in 2022 to finalize a formal program plan, because we recognized that emerald ash borer is sort of come and gone, if you will, and we really needed to sort of structure what our goals and objectives would be of this program moving forward. So that's sort of how we landed at the present. And so, as I mentioned earlier, we worked with the Invasive Species Center to develop this program plan. It's region specific, and they really dove into background materials. They did a jurisdictional scan, and they looked at any number of other invasive species strategies and management plans that are out there. And this is just a sample of some of those things that they dove into. They also conducted staff interviews to really sort of understand the York Region context from all of our local municipalities, conservation authorities, and other partners. And then, like I said, this really applies to regional lands and assets, so our street trees, the York Regional Forest, facility properties. And so that's sort of the basis of this plan, or its application rather. It really hinges, the plan really hinges on the principles of the invasion curve. And that is that preventing arrival and investing in early detection to stop establishment is the most cost-effective solution to managing invasive species. Once a pest is established, management becomes exponentially more expensive and less effective. In fact, a recent international study by Cuthbert found that expenditures on management of established invasive species was 10 times lower than the cost of the damage they cause, while the expenditure on preventative action is actually 25 times lower than reactive measures once a pest becomes established. So that's pretty interesting. So as the invasion curve makes clear, prevention is the most cost-effective way to minimize damage of invasive species. However, once an invasive species is detected, effective response is essential. This involves weighing the risks the species poses against the costs and the feasibility of combating it. Owing to the major role of human activity in introducing and spreading invasive species, education and outreach is integral as well. It's a key aspect of management. And finally, continued collaboration is needed for effective invasive species management at all stages, from prevention to long-term control. So all of this considered, the program plan that we developed has 4 main objectives. So we have protect York Region by assessing information about new threats, and coordinating with other governments on how to best prevent their arrival in the first place, or after arrival to quickly find and eradicate them, or work towards eradication if possible. Respond effectively to established incursions by using information about location, severity, nature of the damage they cause to target containment and control efforts. Educate and engage residents, municipal staff, contractors, and others about risks to the region and how they can help prevent new invasive species from arriving or spreading those that are already present to new areas. Collaborate with partners on research and innovative approaches to detecting invasive species and managing those that are established, as well as advocating to senior levels of government on preventative and management measures. So those are our 4 main buckets that our program plan is based off of. So I'm going to go through some pretty high level examples of some of our actions that come out of these objectives. So one of them is to track, assess, and monitor emerging threats in terms of both likelihood of introduction and severity of impacts to the region, coordinate with and learn from other jurisdictions, including the federal government, especially about new emerging threats and how to prevent their arrival. Partner as appropriate with federal and provincial governments and neighboring jurisdictions on rapid response measures. So that's really giving us that on the ground, like similar to the ALHB that I mentioned earlier, is really allowing our staff and our resources to be put towards this on the ground rapid response. So for respond effectively, we have develop and populate invasive species inventories for region-owned lands, updating them regularly. So we need to refine existing mapping tools and databases, complete annual mapping. We can't manage what we don't know we have. So it's really kind of wrapping our heads around what do we have where and how much. Prioritize the invasive species that should be added to the region's inventories to focus efforts for our, like, where and what are we going to be inventorying. We can't do everything. And then review and update maintenance practices for region-owned lands and assets based on the latest scientific information. So, looking at and identifying opportunities to collaborate with other branches, even just internally within the region on adjusting, say, mowing schedules and things like that. To prevent this further spread, for example. Educate and engage. So examples of this would be to develop a comprehensive invasive species communications plan. We had a very comprehensive Emerald Ash Borer communications plan, but we don't have anything that actually speaks to the higher principles of invasion biology and teaching all of our residents the why should they care and what sort of species to look for and how they are going to actually impact their potential lives and their properties. So that's something that's actually in the works right now. We need broader messaging on invasive species and content that covers priority species for the region. Integrate invasive species messaging into existing programs and campaigns. We have so many things that we do in the York Regional Forest, for instance, that we really want to weave in invasive species messaging and awareness into those existing programs. And then maintain annual invasive species awareness and identification training for seasonal and permanent staff. So we, like many institutions, have any number of students working for us throughout the year. And so it's really important that all of those students who are really a lot of our eyes on the ground, they're out in the field doing a lot of work while the rest of us are stuck behind a computer. And I can honestly say that this has actually worked for us in the past. We actually had a giant hogweed patch discovered by 2 of our forest crew. And it was funny because I can remember them calling me and saying, Dayna, we think we found giant hogweed in the haul tract. And I'm like, a forest? Like, there shouldn't be giant hogweed in a forest. So I'm thinking, of course, okay, it's probably just a misidentification. Nope, they were right. It was giant hogweed. It was actually an example of garden dumping, so encroachment. People were growing giant hogweed purposely in their garden and dumped the yard waste over the fence. And then we had giant hogweed growing right along one of our forest trails. So perfect example as to how you can train your students to actually be those eyes on the ground. And then finally, collaborate. So some examples of this would be to lead and participate in interjurisdictional groups and committees. So the invasive species community of practice is a perfect example of a networking, information sharing and resource sharing group to always be a part of and participate in. And again, continuing our invasive species technical working group in the region is really integral for us. Support and develop research opportunities with the federal and provincial agencies, academia, and industry, really reaching out and offering our street tree network, for instance, or the York Regional Forest for research trials, but also coordinate and collaborate with adjacent landowners to address noxious weeds and invasive species populations. So this image, for instance, is a perfect example of wild parsnip that is growing into a farmer's field. That's a regional road on the west side on the left. And the whole road right away is just full of wild parsnip. So not only is it impacting their soy crop, but it's also impacting our regional road right away. So how can we work with that farmer to address this noxious weed? Okay, very quickly into the management tools. So I could do a whole presentation just on these. The Invasive Species Center really did a lot of heavy lifting when looking at, how do you manage, or how do you make decisions when it comes to managing invasive species? You can't do it all. And so really we came up with this three-tiered approach where essentially it's the what. So what are our priorities in York Region? So we worked with Mackenzie actually to come up with priority species ranking tables. So she did a lot of work on, looking at sort of what are the top threats in York Region. And it actually shook out into, a whole bunch of different groupings, if you will. And that really helped us focus on, essentially deciding on what are we going to focus on. And then the where is, again, we can't do everything everywhere either. So even if we have priority species, can we actually feasibly look at controlling and managing this particular species all over the entire region? Probably not. So again, how do we prioritize our efforts on the ground? And then finally, which a lot of you probably struggle with, is a lot of competing issues where, again, can't do it all. And so we developed, again, with the Invasive Species Center, an active management matrix, we've called it, which is something that will really kind of let you, with less bias, decide what sites may receive active management over others. So just quickly, so examples of the species ranking tables. So it took into consideration 4 weighted categories: ecological impacts, current distribution and abundance, regional impact and management difficulty. And then in the end, we had 4 tables broken down by plants, insects, pathogens, woody species, and then of course, emerging species. So this is an example of emerging species we are not aware of having in York Region at this time. And in some cases, Ontario, I should say. And then the prioritization framework, you won't be able to read the flow chart. And that's really just because of the scale of it. But essentially that it's a decision-making framework for us to question where are our priority areas for mapping, for inventorying, because that, of course, that information is going to inform our active management. And so this was really an exercise to kind of look at where we would prioritize our efforts in terms of on the ground, because again, you just can't map everything. And even if you did, the information can get old really fast. And then finally, really high level, this active management matrix, it's pretty complicated. And this matrix was developed to ensure that invasive species resources allocation decisions are made with consistency. So like I mentioned earlier, it sort of removes that bias. And it's particularly helpful for those gray area priorities, if you will. It guides users through the application of prioritization criteria using a series of 3 classifications. So impacts, feasibility, and support. A user can be guided through a series of suggested endpoints, which can then be used to inform or guide future management decisions. So ultimately, users will receive 3 evaluations of any combination of the following outcomes. So you could receive one of each of these, or you could have all 3 red, or all 3 green, or all 3 yellow, or any combination. So it just sort of helps you kind of weed out your efforts and your sites. And this is housed in Microsoft Forms, and it actually creates a database in the back end that you can archive and download, so that if you have similar scenarios, you can just look back and not have to go through the exercise every single time. Sorry,
Dayna, you have about 1 minute left.
Yeah, I'm on my last slide. So in summary, York Region's Invasive Species Program Plan includes actions to be undertaken over the course of the next 10 years, with many of those actions reflecting work that we are already doing. And of course, assessment and review will take place annually, and that will actually correlate with work planning, essentially. The plan document itself and all associated files and management tools are all in editable formats, so that, as priorities evolve or new species emerge, we can update these documents accordingly. And overall, a combination of these frameworks for decision-making and our, effective use of resources, York Region's Invasive Species Program will hopefully benefit not only our residents, the economy and environment, but Ontario as a whole. So quick shout out to all the staff that helped us with the development of this plan and who participated in interviews to help inform the York Region context or provided feedback from all of these partners. And of course, to the Invasive Species Center for their heavy lifting on many of the management tool development and all this background research, and then Coots and King Limited for the professional writing support. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dayna. That was really wonderful. We do have one question in the chat, which we can hopefully get to really quickly here. They ask, are you currently doing hemlock woolly adelgid monitoring in the York region using what technique? Some detection windows may not align when you have students available.
Yes, so this is true. So fortunately, at York Region, we do actually have student support year-round. We have co-op students through various university streams, so that is very helpful. Interestingly, we were going to start monitoring in the fall for HWA formally, but then I found out that actually the CFIA has already been monitoring in a number of our York Regional Forest sites. So we've actually kind of looked at where they've gone and looked at opportunities for additional monitoring, and we plan to undertake that this year. And we're actually writing a HWA threat assessment currently to kind of wrap our heads around what sort of forest tracks and stands have the highest percentage of hemlock and would be at highest risk of HWA to help inform our monitoring. So it's underway.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. It's really great to know. Thank you for your time, and your presentation was wonderful. We really appreciate you being here.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, I'll move on to our next speaker here. I'm really excited to introduce Krysten Bates and Dayna Shermet from the City of Richmond Hill. We're happy to have you both here to give your presentation entitled It's All Connected, Greening the Hill with the Climate in Mind. The floor is yours.
Great, thanks so much, Madison. And I just want to confirm, can everyone see my screen right now?
Yep, it looks great.
Okay, perfect. All right, so thanks so much everyone for joining us this morning. My name is Krysten Bates and I'm joined by my colleague Dayna Shermet. Together we'll be discussing Richmond Hill's holistic approach to tackling and integrating climate change into our plans, projects, and programs. We'll do this through case studies that'll illustrate both our approach to strategic environmental planning with the climate in mind and on-the-ground implementation of work that addresses and drives further climate action. Ultimately, we found that these initiatives inform and inspire each other because when it comes to climate change, it's all connected. For today's session, I'll start off by briefly introducing our local context before diving into our main topic of discussion, Richmond Hill's holistic approach to climate change planning and action. I'll lead with an overview of how we did this during the recent update to the city's environment strategy, and I'll then pass it over to Dayna to illustrate this approach in action through two of the city's recently implemented environmental initiatives. We'll round out the presentation by tying together the key lessons and learnings from these projects before opening the floor to questions and discussion. So to get us going, I'll set the stage with a bit of historical context. For those unaware, Richmond Hill is located in the Greater Toronto and Hamilton region of Southern Ontario, just north of Toronto. Over the past 50 years, Richmond Hill has grown from a small farming town with a population of 30,000 to a rapidly urbanizing mid-sized city with more than 200,000 residents. The local environment in Richmond Hill contains a number of natural features, including the Oak Ridges Moraine, the headwaters of 3 major rivers, as well as several kettle lakes, urban forests, woodlands, and wetlands. As our city continues to grow, these are among the key features that we're striving to protect, enhance, and restore. Since 2014, Richmond Hill's environment strategy, Greening the Hill, Our Community, Our Future, has served as that core guiding document that directs how we protect, enhance, and restore our natural environment. To date, more than half of the strategy's actions have been completed, are underway, or are ongoing. Among those completed include key plans and studies with connections to climate change, such as the city's Community Energy and Emissions Plan and Urban Forest Management Plan, as well as countless tangible improvements such as tree plantings and community stewardship, active transportation upgrades, invasive species management, energy conservation, and much more. To continue building momentum, Sorry, everyone. To continue building momentum and to plan for further environmental action, we recently embarked on an update to the environment strategy, which was finalized and approved by our council in July 2022. The updated environment strategy is a comprehensive and holistic plan that aims to preserve and enhance Richmond Hill's air, land, and water by greening our consumption, greening our natural spaces, and greening our growth. It contains 90 actions divided into 10 independent yet interrelated themes to be implemented by 2031. These themes include energy, transportation, water resource management, water conservation, sustainable land development, natural heritage and urban forest, invasive species, wildlife, local food and pollinators, and waste. You may have noticed, however, and in this diagram over to the right, that climate change hasn't been listed as one of our main themes within the strategy update. One of the challenges that we faced during the strategy's development, and I think this is a common challenge for many municipalities these days, was figuring out how to best integrate climate change considerations into the strategy without duplicating the efforts of existing city climate plans and initiatives. We recognized and heard from our residents and stakeholders early on that given the urgency and the magnitude of the climate crisis, the updated environment strategy would need to ensure that climate change is adequately represented and addressed through the strategy's actions. However, climate change actions in Richmond Hill had largely been considered and planned for already during the development of the city's recently approved community energy and emissions plan, corporate climate change framework, and even other plans and studies that have ties, including our urban forest management plan. However, ultimately, we determined that the best way to address this challenge was to view the entire strategy through the lens of climate change. Rather than creating a standalone climate change theme, we recognized that the issue is so pervasive, all-encompassing, and interconnected that it made more sense for us to embed climate change action throughout the document within and amongst our 10 themes. Although we didn't really follow a formal methodology, the approach we took was threefold. First, we reviewed our climate change specific plans and frameworks to prioritize key shorter term actions that could be reinforced by integrating them within the appropriate theme in the environment strategy. Next, we reviewed all other potential actions through the lens of climate change by asking, does this action have a direct or indirect climate change mitigation and or adaptation benefit? And then if so, we considered opportunities to either adjust the action's wording or clearly spell out the climate change connections in the actions where possible. And then finally, Finally, we ensured that the preamble and background context sections for each theme speak directly to how that theme connects to climate change. For example, in our preamble for our transportation theme, we begin by acknowledging that transportation accounts for more than 40% of our community's total GHG emissions, and that taking action to reduce transportation emissions will contribute to the net zero future that the city is striving for. In going through this exercise, resoundingly, we found that almost every action within the strategy update plays a role in improving resiliency and or mitigating the city's contributions to climate change. From invasive species to local food to waste management, these issues are all connected, and recognizing these connections has been essential to building and delivering comprehensive and cohesive programs and projects. I'll now pass it over to Dayna to share examples of how this interconnectedness has been considered and has played out in practice through the delivery of 2 recent city environmental initiatives.
Thank you, Kristen. So as she mentioned, I'm going to give 2 examples, and we have geared these specifically to this audience. So the first example is the city's recently completed invasive species response procedure. And as you can see on the screen, developing invasive species management strategy and action plan is identified as a priority action in the environment strategy. It's also noted in the urban forest management plan, climate change framework, and the SEEP. However, it's not scheduled to commence until 2026. So we recognize that the city needs a more formal way to respond until that strategic plan is developed. And the updated environment strategy identified a new action that was to create an internal response procedure to help guide the city's response to invasive species. So the purpose of the procedure is to guide the city's response to priority invasive species that impact our infrastructure, restoration investments, and health and safety. So it is predominantly reactive in nature, but it does allow us to respond to invasive species consistently within the city. We also recognize that the climate is changing and it's creating more favorable environments for a variety of species. So we developed the response procedure in a way that provides us the opportunity to be proactive and act as a form of an early detection tool. So within the document, we've created a watch list of species that are not well established or present in Ontario that could have an impact on the 3 above themes: infrastructure, restoration, or health and safety. And we're continuing to assess other species and add them to the watch list as required. And to support this, we're providing training to all staff involved in invasive species response, as well as other staff working on the ground, which includes horticultural and parks infrastructure staff, as they act as the eyes and ears on the ground. Lastly, through this process, we're also formalizing other best practices that will help us to continue to be proactive in invasive species response. So we've started pruning oak trees in advance of oak wilt becoming present in Ontario and ensuring that all oak pruning occurs between November to March. We're also working with our parks and natural heritage planning staff to ensure oaks are staggered in the planting details to reduce root grafting. And we're also diversifying our street plantings and have increased our planting list from approximately 40 species to over 130 species to help create a more diverse and resilient urban forest. So the second example of incorporating climate change into our work is the city's recently completed urban forest study. So the urban forest study was done in partnership with York Region and Toronto Region Conservation Authority. So first off, I do want to give thanks to York Region for the funding and coordination of the study, and TRCA for all the fieldwork, analysis, and report writing. So the urban forest study was completed in 2012, and that data was used to inform the city's urban forest management plan. And this update allows us to measure and compare our progress over time. And most of the parameters of this recent study were the same as the 2012 one, which included distribution of canopy cover, available planting opportunities, composition, and overall condition of the urban forest, as well as valuing the ecosystem services. So one addition to the 2022 study included a climate vulnerability assessment. And this assessment was twofold. So we looked at the general impacts of climate change on the urban forest. And for this, we used the worst case scenario based on business as usual. And we used if so then statements. So identifying the stressors, the impacts that would come from those stressors, and the expected consequences. Secondly, we also looked at the vulnerability of Richmond Hill's most abundant trees. And for this, we used Peel Region's Urban Forest Best Practice Guide. So we know what the stressors of climate change are, but what impacts do those stressors have on the urban forest? So with an increase in frequency and severity of weather events, we expect to see greater damage to urban trees and higher mortality rates. With an increase in average temperature, expecting warmer winters and drier summers, we expect to see an increase in stress response, leading to loss of leaves, reduced growth, disruptions in seed production, as well as shifting ecoregions, changes in species composition, and increased risk of pests and diseases. And then from an increase in extreme precipitation, we expect to see greater damage to urban trees, higher mortality rates, increased soil erosion, and increase in stress and decline in tree growth. So some of the consequences of these impacts include a general loss of ecological goods and services of the urban forest, a decline in its diversity, increase in the maintenance and replacement costs to the city, as well as increased survival and spread of invasive pests and diseases. So we also looked at climate vulnerability at the species level. And we looked at Richmond Hill's top 20 trees and assessed their vulnerability to climate change. 12 of those 20 species are considered highly or extremely vulnerable to climate change. And if we look at Richmond Hill's 5 most abundant trees, they all score as highly vulnerable to climate change. And that means that over 50% of Richmond Hill's urban forest is vulnerable to climate change. And some of the consequences of this include risk of extirpation, particularly for eastern white cedar. Since it's it's at the most southern edge of its range. I think we just lost the slides.
Sorry, yeah, my PowerPoint just completely shut down. Hold on one second.
Okay. All right. So buckthorn was the second species listed there, and it was also noted as highly vulnerable to climate change. So this could actually be a positive thing because it could help with control efforts because buckthorn can be intolerant to drought. Oh, there we go. We're good. Yeah. Okay. So, and then for the last three species, white pine, green ash, and white spruce, we do expect to see those populations decline within Richmond Hill. So tying it all together, many of the recommendations from the urban forest study aligned with our existing strategies and helps to reinforce the importance of those actions. In addition, the insight that we got from the study will help to inform our current and future work. And some of these examples include ensuring that our planting list take into consideration climate vulnerability, carbon storage and sequestration, and energy savings. Considering range expansion and assisted migration in our planting strategies, continuing to educate and incentivize residents to diversify their plantings through our healthy yards and community stewardship programs, and continuing to enforce our tree preservation bylaws and use our specifications and standards for tree spacing and soil volume to create the right environments that will help to increase the proportion of large trees in the city, thus increasing the services that they provide. So to wrap it all up, these are just two examples of our work, but there's a lot of actions being done by many groups working together within the city and across the community. And a common theme is that they are directed by and continue to inform future work and programming in the city. And it's these plans that set the foundation for how the city works to protect the environment with the climate in mind. So at this point, we'll open it up to any questions if there are any.
Thank you both so much. That was an excellent presentation. It's really great to see climate change so integrated into all your strategies and into the invasive species management plans. If you have any questions for our speakers, please pop them into the Q&A box. We do have two of them here already. Are there other trees being planted in the urban environment native?
So in that increased list that I referred to at the beginning, it does include some non-native species, recognizing that they can be more tolerant to the urban environment and the stresses associated with being planted in an urban environment. But we do ensure that any plantings within our restoration plans or the community stewardship programs, that those are all native species.
Awesome, it's good to know. Mm-hmm. We have a question here. We've got a ton of buckthorn in an alvar environment, which has already gotten pretty dry. Good to know that they might be less drought tolerant. Helps us plan their replacement species when we remove it. Can you elaborate on buckthorn being sensitive to climate change?
So from my understanding is that it is intolerant to drought. The Peel region study, they had done a very thorough assessment. Off the top of my head, I don't know all the details, but if you go to the Peel region website, they have a great report on the assessment that they did to determine the vulnerability of all the different, I think they looked at 88 different street tree species for plantings. And while buckthorn is not a species that you would plant, they did look at the vulnerability of that one.
Awesome, that's great to know. Oh, another question came in here. Are native species sourced from sources suitable for Ontario planting, or are they from warmer sites that may be more vulnerable in the short term?
That is a great question. And from my understanding, they are from localized sites right now. So I did mention we will be looking at the opportunity for assisted migration. But at this point, we want to make sure that we understand it well and we have a strategy around it and that we just don't start planting a species that might not acclimatize well to this environment.
Okay, awesome. And one more question here. Hi, Dayna and Krysten, thanks for a great talk, really comprehensive planning. How do you measure how you are doing? Any key metrics that you track on the invasive species and climate front?
I can take that one, and thank you for the question. So the environment strategy includes a couple of reporting metrics or components, I should say. The first is an environmental scorecard. Richmond Hill produced our first environmental scorecard back in 2020, and it tracks our high-level progress through a few key indicators from 2015 to 2019. And we didn't include a specific invasive species indicator, although we did include counts related to native wildlife and plant species in Richmond Hill. So that's included within the scorecard. And then in terms of climate change, more specifically, we do have GHG and energy metrics for both community and corporate, from both the community and corporate side that we include in that scorecard. And that is kind of to provide a high level snapshot of progress. And then in terms of the specific actions within the strategy, every year we've made a commitment to going back to council every year with a report that outlines progress for each of our actions that are already underway or ongoing. And we just provide a little bit of an update on key accomplishments and improvements that are made through the strategy. And then we also produce a public facing highlight sheet that will feature key accomplishments for that given year. And, if invasive species related pieces are one of those, then we include that on that highlight sheet that we give to council and circulate out to the public. Hopefully that helps.
Okay, we're back. Okay, well, thank you so much for your presentation. We'll have to move on here to the next speaker, but I really appreciate your time. It's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Nicole Carpenter from Georgian Bay Forever, who will speak on a community-based approach to invasive Phragmites management for the health of our water and wetlands. Thanks so much for being here, Nicole, and I'll pass it over to you.
Thanks, Madison. If you don't mind just confirming once I share my screen that everything looks good, that would be great.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, does that look good?
Yes, it looks awesome.
Okay, thank you. All right, hello, good morning, everyone. I'm Nicole, and I'm the Science Projects Manager at Georgian Bay Forever. And like Madison said, I'm going to be talking about our community-based approach to the management of invasive Phragmites for the health of our water and wetlands. Georgian Bay Forever is a charity dedicated to scientific research and public education on Georgian Bay's aquatic ecosystems. Our mission is to protect, enhance, and restore the aquatic ecosystem of Georgian Bay by funding accredited research and taking action on water levels, water quality, and ecosystems. Today, my presentation will highlight some of the methods, progress, and success of our community-based initiatives across the southeastern Georgian Bay coast. So Georgian Bay is located in Lake Huron, and it's amongst the most diverse ecosystems in the Great Lakes, composed of incredibly complex habitats. So we have swamps, marshes, Canadian shield, lots of islands and archipelagos, and large tributaries that feed the bay. Compared to some of the areas around the Great Lakes, Georgian Bay can be considered relatively untouched, especially along the east and northern shores, though southern Georgian Bay is quite populated with towns and cities such as Midland, Tiny, Collingwood, and Owen Sound. And in this area, or in these areas, we do see a bit more of an impact to the bay due to human activity. Protecting Georgian Bay means protecting the thousands of people that live and work around the bay, that rely on it for clean drinking water, recreation, food supply, and more, but also the plants and animals that make the bay what it is today and what we hope to preserve for future generations. So one of our main activities is our long-running invasive Phragmites removal program that has seen years of change, success, and challenges in Georgian Bay. Our work began about 10 years ago, and this is when we applied for funding to begin efforts against invasive Phragmites in Collingwood, and sort of starting there and moving forward, we became increasingly aware of the need for Phragmites education and control across Georgian Bay. By 2019, we developed a 5-year community-based program for about 600 stands that were identified across 3 municipalities in southeastern Georgian Bay. And these were municipalities that were supporting the work that we do. One of the key components, excuse me, to success of this program is to collaborate with volunteers, municipalities, Indigenous communities, and other communities around Georgian Bay, so that at the end of the 5 years, we can confidently leave the responsibility of Phragmites control and monitoring to these communities, which leads to a sustainable method of environmental management, and in this case, Phragmites control. A large part of this program has been to offer employment to local summer students within these municipalities to assist in the program. So we receive generous support from the local municipalities, as well as the community or cottage associations within these areas to hire our summer staff and pay for equipment and things like that needed to do needed for the work that we do. So these charts here are starting in 2019. So starting at the beginning of this 5-year program, the charts have different colors representing different level of treatment. So red represents sites left untreated at the end of the year. Yellow are sites that we cut, and green are sites that are in a monitoring stage. So they've had 0 regrowth. You'll notice each year the whole pie getting larger. So each year we're adding more sites to our management plan because of the success that we've been having. So you'll notice each year the green and the yellow. So these are the sites under control by communities and volunteers, as well as our staff. And those slices are getting bigger. So this allows us to relocate our efforts into other areas of the bay and start adding new sites into the control plan. So currently we're looking at 968 stands under management, and we have about 53% of them with 0 regrowth. So I just want to talk a little bit about the success we've had across these communities and municipalities and the positive results that we've seen. So this map here shows sort of the northeastern area of our range. So this is northern Georgian Bay Township and the township of the Archipelago. The Archipelago is one of the original municipalities we worked with, and this area is now nearly at 100% control and 100% community led, which is fantastic. The main reason for this is the dedication of these communities and the municipality, and the persistency to monitor and remove Phragmites each year. Being that this area is farther north, we do see in general a smaller number of sites and less growth. And the communities further south do have a higher density of Phragmites to deal with. So this is where us and our staff spend more of their time during the summer to work in these areas and decrease the size and number of sites, making it more manageable for communities to take on in the future. The Township of Georgian Bay, we started working together before this 5-year plan was developed. And again, they have provided us with annual support in their budget to go towards Phragmites control, and we're seeing 87% control here. Aside from the regular budget, this municipality has also been recently including us in applying for larger provincial grants and things like that towards wetland restoration. Tay Township is another municipality we've been working for a few years now. It started off with, we've got about 200 to 300 sites in this municipality, and we are at 75% control in 3 years of working here. And the Township of Severn is a new municipality that we'll be working with. We have done work in, excuse me, Matchedash Bay for a couple years, and this year we approached the township, being able to show some of the work that we have done with invasive Phragmites in the wetland and what we've been able to do. And now we've been lucky enough to receive their support for 2023. So we're really excited about this. So now I just want to talk a little bit about the need for province-wide coordination with invasive Phragmites control, but really this is seen across the board with invasive Phragmites management. Part of protecting management investments made is implementing and improving road management by all stakeholders. as we know, the roads act as major travel vectors for invasive Phragmites. Georgian Bay Forever and our partners have made many efforts in increasing MTO and municipal participation. As we all know, the roads are major travel vectors and for Phragmites and other invasive species. And one thing that we have learned that's very important to understand the scope of the problem and be able to visually display it. So often approaching municipalities or having, we see municipalities or community groups that struggle to get started in invasive Phragmites or invasive species management simply because they may not know the entire scope of the problem. So things like road mapping or wetlands or, well, in our case, wetlands and shoreline mapping has been really beneficial to do, and to sometimes municipalities and groups don't have the resources to be able to do this on their own. So one thing that we have started doing and we will be doing in 2023 is a partnership with the Nature Conservancy, and there's a few other organizations involved in this as well, and compiling that road mapping data that will be very accurate. So and this is something that we can go to communities or municipalities. These other organizations can utilize. So kind of like EdMaps, or iNaturalist, but everything is being confirmed and being more accurate. Back in 2021, we hosted a webinar with the Township of the Archipelago, and we provided suggested resolutions for municipalities to help improve their management action of Phragmites. And the Township of the Archipelago sent these resolutions to each municipality in Ontario. These suggestions included things like implementing proper management protocols, joining the Ontario Phragmites Working Group, requesting MTO to do mapping and treatment, and requesting all government levels to consider funding support. To wrap everything up, we have been working with Phragmites for the past 10 years, and it's taken time overcoming barriers, building relationships in the community to get to where we are now. If there are municipalities or communities out there looking to get started with invasive species management, I highly recommend looking to your local nonprofits for help and to invest in them. Thank you for listening, and I have my contact information up here if anyone has any questions.
Thank you so much, Nicole. That was a great presentation. If you have any questions for Nicole, please pop them into the Q&A box and I'll read them out loud here. We do have one question that came in. What techniques have you used to map the non-road areas, example, wetlands and shorelines?
Yeah, sure. So to map those areas, we have boats to access it. So working in Georgian Bay specifically. Oh, sorry. Just going to put my contact info back up there. There we go. Yeah, so getting in wetlands is really difficult. So we have different boats. We have motorboats, we have canoes, kayaks, and things like that to access these areas. Getting in there with hip waders, so it can be a little tricky. But yeah.
Nice. Okay. Awesome. Yeah. How would the management differ between like managing Phragmites growing in the water and wetlands or versus the roadside?
So we focus on, we only do manual removal methods. So we're using often the cut to drown method for invasive Phragmites, which is, if anyone is unaware, it's cutting the Phragmite stock below the water level. And then the water acts it fills up the Phragmites has a hollow root system. So the water fills that up and drowns it out. But sometimes wetlands can be a little tricky if they're shallow, or if they're kind of like a fen or a really sensitive environment. We kind of have to play around with using the spading method or the cut to drown method, sort of just depending on the type of ecosystem that you're in. In relation to, I remembered something from the first question. One thing that we are looking into is doing some drone mapping in this upcoming season. We haven't done any of it yet, but it is something we're interested in. So if there's anyone listening and has done drone mapping already, please reach out to me because it's something we're really excited about, and it'll help us get into these inaccessible locations and have a less of an impact initially on the wetland.
Awesome. Yeah, it sounds like a cool project on the horizon then. We have some additional questions coming in here. Did you approach road contractors when we have seen major road work not long after we are now seeing Phragmites in the adjacent ditches?
Yes, we have more so, I wouldn't say road contractors. We've talked with municipalities about this, and that kind of goes back to having municipalities pass these resolutions to implement the like clean equipment protocols and things like that. But no, we have not gone to road contractors, but that is a good idea because we do see that a lot. But we are more so focused on aquatic growth in Georgian Bay. We're just sort of starting to get into more of this provincial roadside treatment and education.
Right, okay, nice. Is the roadside management dock shareable?
Currently, it is not. It is. We're just in the works of doing it. So this is a new year. 2023 will be starting to do that. But what the idea is, there's going to be a few organizations that are going to be that will have access to it, but then we will be able to share it amongst others. So hopefully by 2023, if there's information or data that you are interested in, you can reach out to us and we'll hopefully be able to share it. But I will say it will be focused around Georgian Bay to start off with.
Right, awesome, good to know, thank you. This person here says, great initiative and thank you for the presentation. I may have missed this, however, how are you defining eradicated?
Yeah, so we use this term eradicated or monitored. I would say once we get to a site and see zero regrowth, because Phragmites takes multiple years of control for it to, before it's considered eradicated. And I use quotes because there are times that we do see growth come back. And so that's why we continue to monitor the site. So this really, like I said, just means we're seeing zero regrowth and we continue to check it, which means we just boat by or drive by each year to make sure nothing has come back. And if something does, we can quickly nip it, as well as this will get left to community members or volunteers if it's on their property or something like that. But yeah, it's kind of a flexible term.
Awesome, thank you. Can your mapping data be uploaded into EdMaps?
I believe it could. I think we used to do that. We tried to do it and we had a lot of issues because we weren't able to update it with our consistent treatment. But I will say for Georgian Bay Forever, for us ourselves, the 900 sites that we do manage, we do have a public interactive map on our website. There's a link to it that you can access. But yeah, as of right now, we're not doing any uploading to EdMaps.
Good to know. Are there places that you've tried but were unable to eradicate? What is the difference there?
Yeah, there are places that we have a hard time, and it's usually in areas where they're very shallow or they're more of a terrestrial site. And we're kind of going back and forth and trying to find out which technique it will best fit that area. In Georgian Bay, we see a lot of changes in water levels, so that is a big challenge to our management. In general, I find terrestrial control like the spading method and things like that to be a lot more labor intensive and not as successful as the cut to drown method. So these are areas where we are seeking help from organizations like the Invasive Phragmites Control Center, who can maybe bring out the trucksters to do manual removal or pass it along to municipalities to see if they can invest in some sort of other type of control. But we definitely do have a struggle in some areas, but sometimes just being able to manage the size of the site, at least to prevent the spread of it, can be beneficial.
Yeah, for sure. Have you considered using IMAP for the treatment data?
IMAP?
That's what they say here, yeah.
No, I have not. I've never heard of it. So, but that's interesting to know. I'll have to look that up.
Yeah, well, maybe they can reach out with more info, or you can reach out to
them.
them.
That would be great.
Oh, IMAP invasives, they say.
Okay. I still don't really know. I haven't used that before, but I will look it up. That sounds helpful. There's a lot of different mapping platforms out there.
There really are. Yeah, lots of different tools available. This one person says they have done drone mapping for Environment Canada and they popped in their information. So if you check that out, maybe that could be something
Yeah.
Good to meet you.
Will that be in the
Q&A.
chat?
In the Q&A box, yeah.
Okay. Great.
Well,
That's
it for
perfect.
questions. Thank you so much for your time. Your presentation was really great, and it was nice to have you here.
Awesome. Thank you.
No problem. We'll move on to the next speaker here, the final speaker of this session. We have Emily Posteraro, who's a program development coordinator here at the Invasive Species Center. She'll be discussing the impacts of invasive species on Canadian municipalities based on 2021 survey results. So take it away, Em.
Hi, Maddie. Thanks for the introduction. Just going to get going here.
Looks good.
Okay, great. Yeah, so I'll go right ahead then. So ISC works with municipalities a fair bit, and so we kind of know from experience that they're often on the front lines of dealing with invasive species. And so I have some headlines just from local news sources as examples of that to share with you, because invasive species impacts can often be felt kind of immediately by people in their communities. And so, cities and towns have to deal with that. So one example there, I have giant hogweed. It's pictured on the top right there. And if you don't know about it, that's a plant that can cause pretty severe burns on the skin upon contact. And so that pops up in, city parks and just off trails all the time. You can see it's been discovered in the Don Valley area in Toronto. That gets a lot of foot traffic, so that's something that cities have to deal with. We, of course, just had a presentation on Phragmites, and we're seeing cities increasingly interested in dealing with that. There's obviously ecological impacts, but also recreational impacts for people who want to enjoy wetlands and natural spaces where Phragmites often kind of takes over. Another example, you might all remember the big spongy moth caterpillar outbreaks that took place in the summer of 2021 in parts of central Canada. And so those were defoliating people's, nice street and yard trees. And so cities were dealing with that pretty heavily. I also have emerald ash borer pictured there, devastated ash trees all over. And that's going to come up a few more times in this presentation. Okay, so basically, we know there's these heavy impacts. We wanted to start to quantify those economic impacts. We did that in collaboration with the Invasive Alien Species National Committee and Environment and Climate Change Canada by disseminating the National Invasive Species Municipal Expenditures Survey. And then we had analysis completed by Dr. Richard Javine. And now this was a pretty extensive 78 question survey. We wanted to know a lot of different things, but I'll kind of just go over some of them. So one thing we wanted to know was, of course, the big numbers. So the total annual cost of invasive species to Canadian municipalities. We also wanted to see how those costs actually broke down by different kinds of invasive species activities. So, what is spent just on detecting invasives, what's spent on preventing them, control and management, habitat restoring, and research. We also asked municipalities what their priority species were, and we asked that across different taxa. We wanted to quantify non-financial costs, so like volunteer hours or in-kind costs. And we also asked municipalities how much they expected their invasive species costs to increase over a 5-year time period. So this survey was open to all different municipality types, so including counties, regional municipalities, and villages. However, I will note that it was restricted to just municipalities. So, national or provincial parks or other entities, their expenditures were not included. This was just on municipalities. So the goal was to contact municipalities to cover at least 80% of the population in each province and territory. We distributed it primarily through email, but also made some phone calls and did a lot of promo on social media. And basically, we targeted relevant departments at municipalities to respond. So, Parks and Rec, Forestry, Public Works, departments of that nature. So we got a response rate representing 39% of Canada's population, which was great. It was considered, high enough to perform the analysis that was needed. I will just note that that response rate was not necessarily consistent across the country. You can see that map there, how many cities in each province or region responded. And so you can see it's a bit higher in, for example, Quebec and BC, and a little bit lower in some other areas like the territories, for example. So obviously we did not get to survey every single municipality in Canada, which means we had to make an estimation based of the total cost based on the data that we had. And so Dr. Vine did that by using 2 different extrapolation approaches, and then he actually took the average of those 2. And I'll show how that breaks down in a minute. But basically the first extrapolation approach was conducted based on per capita expenditures. So just, multiplied by the number of people in Canada according to the census. And then the second approach, basically just taking the average expenditure for all the municipalities that responded and multiplying that across all Canadian municipalities. And so basically those 2 calculations were conducted up to the provincial and territorial level first before being aggregated up to the national level. And that's just to account for regional variations in expenditures. So basically, when you do that first per capita approach, you end up with $95.8 million being spent by municipalities per year, which the analyst thought was likely to be an underestimate. When you do the other approach, you get $400 million per year, which he thought was maybe an overestimate. And so he took the average of those 2. And so we get a total of $247.9 million spent each year on invasive species in Canada just by municipalities. And that works out to $7.05 per person. So big number there, but like I said, we wanted to know a lot of different things in this survey, so I'm going to cover some other results too. So we had just over 3/4 of municipalities, not surprising to us, indicating costs incurred due to invasive species activities, but a little over 60% of respondents indicated that funding was not sufficient for management. So that was, a significant finding for us. In-kind spending was reported by about 1/4 of municipalities, and that had an average value of $22,180. The majority of expenditures were incurred for control and management activities, so it's pretty overwhelming, over 60%. I'll show you how that breaks down in a graphic in a moment. And expenditures were expected to increase over the next 5 years, with a vast majority of respondents estimating either a less than 25% increase or a 25 to 50% increase. So I'm going to show you those last 2, how they're represented graphically. So this is how the expenditures break down according to different invasive species activities. So you can see how overwhelming that control proportion is, whereas prevention has, comparatively little spending, 13.6% on preventative activities. And then for the next one, so this is what was reported as the estimated increases to municipal costs of invasive species management over the next 5 years. So most reported either below 25% or between 25 and 50%, which is definitely significant. I will point out that almost 10% of respondents said they expected an over 100% increase, so doubling. And we also had some species-specific findings, which I'd like to share. So we did ask municipalities, what's your #1 priority species? And so the top 5 that we got from that question were emerald ash borer, which was reported as a #1 priority by 20 municipalities in Canada, followed by Dutch elm disease, Japanese knotweed, giant hogweed, and Eurasian water milfoil. And so those priorities were also kind of reflected in the species-specific costs as well. So the highest species-specific expenditure was over $4.8 million spent just on emerald ash borer. So that took up almost 1/3 of all reported species-specific expenditures, followed by Eurasian water milfoil, almost $1.3 million being spent on that, and Dutch elm disease, about $1.1 million being spent on that. We also asked municipalities what their emerging species of concern were. And so the top 5 responses there were for zebra and quagga mussels, wild boar, emerald ash borer, Asian longhorn beetle, and giant hogweed. Now you see some species there as emerging species just because obviously Canada is a big country, and in different regions, some species are already established, some are not there yet, but they're an emerging concern. So all very good information, but there are, of course, limitations to the data and some considerations to take into account, which I'll just go over. This was a voluntary survey design, which, as with any survey design of that nature, creates a potential sample bias. So, just in this case, probably municipalities that did incur expenses due to invasive species were more likely to actually complete the survey and report that. The method assumes accurate and full data from respondents, which can actually sometimes be a little bit hard to provide. So, for example, sometimes with cities, they don't necessarily have their costs broken down by individual species. So they might have, a budget for just general weed control costs without knowing the proportion used for, let's say Phragmites or giant hogweed. But it still gives us a valuable insight into spending on managing invasive plants. There was a relatively low response rate from Ontario. However, we did do an Ontario-specific 2019 survey. It wasn't just on municipalities. I think it included conservation authorities as well. But the analyst, Dr. Vine, did kind of make the comparison within the 2021 report, and that 2019 report is available on our website as well, so you can kind of compare the two. It should be noted that the survey was based on 2020 expenditures, which, as we know, was when COVID-19 pandemic hit, and many respondents did note that it was a bit of an unusual year for spending, so expenditures were probably reduced just due to the pandemic. So overall, we do think the costs are likely to be an underestimate, but the results are an important opportunity to understand municipal priorities and challenges. So basically what we are taking away from this survey is that funding for invasive species activities is an issue faced by a large number of municipalities in Canada. The expenditures could be even higher if more funding was available. Remember, many reported that it wasn't sufficient. The majority of spending is spent on control and management, despite the fact that we know that investment in prevention is more cost effective. And the majority of respondents said that costs of invasive species management would increase over the next 5 years. So this report in its entirety is available on our website in English and French, so you can check that out for yourself. I want to thank the Environment and Climate Change Canada Invasive Alien Species National Committee and our analyst, Dr. Richard Vine, for their support and contributions in this project. And I know that, of course, the theme of our forum this year is invasive species and climate change. And so I wanted to kind of, tie all this in together with my presentation. So you'll remember at the beginning of my talk, I said that, municipalities were on the front lines of dealing with the immediate community impacts of invasive species. I think it's fair to say they're also on the front lines of dealing with climate change, for example, with flooding and heat waves. So one way that invasive species exacerbates that is with the emerald ash borer, for example, which has come up a lot, decimated a lot of municipal street trees. And so it removed, many benefits, of course, that street trees offer, but among those includes removing crucial canopy cover that provides shade and also cools local climate via evapotranspiration. So, basically that's one little insect that is exacerbating the impacts of warming. Warmer temperatures can also facilitate the spread of certain invasive species. So, we have the fungus that causes oak wilt, hemlock woolly adelgid, and spotted lanternfly on the horizon because, our cold winters are perhaps no longer cold enough to actually kill them before they can establish. So if you liked this talk, you want to know more, there's lots of additional resources on the Invasive Species Center website. As I mentioned, there was that 2019 Ontario report that might be interesting for you to compare with. We have a fact sheet based on that report as well. We also have a municipalities infrastructure fact sheet, which you can check out. And I believe it's been shared a fair bit in the chat, but I do facilitate our municipal community of practice, just brings together invasive species practitioners from municipalities and conservation authorities. We have an online space and 2 conference calls per year, which I facilitate. Just allows people to exchange expertise, so you can check that out and register online. We also have 3 excellent publicly accessible databases on our website that municipal practitioners might be able to take advantage of. So between best management practices and the 2 risk assessment databases, we have over 2,000 entries. So definitely check those out. Thank you so much for listening to my talk today. I'm obviously here to take any more questions, or you can also email me at eposteraro@invasivespeciescenter.ca.
Thanks so much, Em. That was a great presentation. If you have any questions for Emily, please pop it in the Q&A box and I'll read them out loud for her. I'll kick off the questions here. How do you think the survey data will be used?
Yeah, so it's kind of up to how people want to use it. We hope that it'll be used to make the case for investment in prevention above anything else. Because basically using that survey data, you can show, expenditures are high, but they're overwhelmingly being spent on control. And so, I didn't really get to kind of break down how this works in my presentation, but we do already know from prior studies that, you get more bang for your buck basically with prevention. So we hope people will use that data to sort of make that case. So, could maybe be used for grant applications or for research projects. But yeah, the report is there and free to use and cite.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Well, I don't see any other questions coming in, but Emily did pop in her email on her slides. We added the email to the chat bar as well. So you can always reach out with additional questions to Emily. So thank you so much, everybody, for attending this session of the day. Thank you to all of our speakers and all of our attendees for joining. We really do appreciate it. I will pass it over to Mackenzie to sign us off here.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for sitting in on that great municipalities session, learning about invasive species management going on in our communities in Ontario. So thanks for taking us through, Maddie, and thanks to all of our great speakers. We're going to take a 15-minute break here and come back at 10:30 to start our next session, which will be Forest Invasives Part 1, Developments in Research and Management. So join us back for that exciting session at 10:30, and we'll see you then. Thank you.